Hi everyone, and welcome to the second of the Investival Showcase Masterclasses. We are joined by Covington, who are giving a masterclass on planning and implementing successful digital health projects. Before we sort of kick off today's masterclass, just to go through a couple of admin points to ensure that you get the most of the session as you can. If you want to ask a question throughout the session, we will do our very best to get to them. You can do so in the chat function at the bottom of your screen, or alternatively, and if you would prefer, you can also use the reactions button, which is the smiley face at the bottom of your screen. And if you click on that, there is a raise hand function, which, as you will see, puts a little hand in the top corner. Here it is. There we go. And we'll obviously get to answering those questions as quickly as we can. So without further ado, Daniel, Joshua, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Becky. Well, look, welcome to this session. As Becky said, it's on planning and implementing successful digital health projects. And so in this, what we're going to discuss are some key steps to take in the run up to and putting together digital health projects, and with a particular emphasis on collaborations. So first off, some brief introductions. So my name's Daniel Pavin. I'm a partner at Covington. We're an international law firm, and we have a particular focus on life sciences and healthcare. My particular focus is on commercial agreements in that space, and in particular digital health. And I'm joined by my colleague, Josh Gray. He's a special counsel here at Covington with a technology and data privacy focused practice, and again has a particular specialism in digital health deals. And we are delighted to have with us Junaid Bajwa. So Junaid is the Chief Medical Scientist at Microsoft Research. Now we're all actually getting the benefit of 4 expert panelists in one, because Junaid is also a practicing physician in the NHS, and he was previously the global lead for strategic alliances and solutions for the Global Digital Centre of Excellence at Merck Sharp and Dohme. He also co-founded Velocity Health, which is Europe's first prevention-focused digital health accelerator, and that was done together with Telefonica. So this means that Junaid is uniquely placed to share his thoughts from the perspective of big tech, big pharma, emerging digital health companies, and healthcare systems. So it's absolutely great to have you with us, Junaid. So to set the scene, as you'll appreciate, this is a big subject. So we're going to focus on just a few topics that have been prominent in digital health deals that collectively we've been involved with. We're going to look at the preliminary stages. So before you get into a specific deal, we'll look at effective ideation once you're at the outset of a deal, some diligence considerations. Then balancing pharma and tech perspectives, and issues when collaborating with hospital systems. If we've got time, we'll explore some other features of digital health collaborations, such as data flows and anonymization. So we'll dive in then to some issues at the preliminary stages of your thinking about digital health deals. So over to you, Josh.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks everybody for joining. So for the first topic we wanted to cover, it's around just understanding really why you embarking on a particular digital health project. What is it that you hope to achieve? How will value be demonstrated? What are the capabilities required, and the like? So we'll talk a bit about this, and it's really important to do this work up front. A lot of digital health projects are often very fluid, and things are unknown in terms of the outcomes that will necessarily be reached, how things technically may work in full detail, but nonetheless, it's hugely important to get a really good understanding about how things are going to work generally and the overall roadmap for where you want to go. So the first question and first thing to think about is what is the need that you're trying to address for this particular project? Is there a gap in a particular capability? Is there a disease area that you're trying to understand better? Is there an improvement in waiting times for a particular type of hospital organization? What is it that you're trying to do? That's the first thing you need to ask yourself. And then the next thing is, how do you think you're going to do that with a partner, and how would you want to go about the particular project? We encounter two typical models for these sorts of projects. One is a collaboration model, which we see more and more of, or the other is more of a transactional model. So in the transactional model, this might be where you as either a healthcare provider or a technology provider or a pharma provider engaging someone else on really a commercial basis to provide something to you. Now, there's plenty of scope for transactional relationships in digital health projects, but we tend to find these are maybe not always the most interesting, and also can be some of the more limited arrangements. If you really want to do something innovative and new in the digital health space, we find that collaborations are actually a better way to frame the project. You often have parties coming together to do something that hasn't been done before, and involves a really close working relationship to define and understand things, and how you might go about doing them. Now, this is a really important question to ask at the outset, because it sets the tone and the tenor for any commercial engagement. And in a commercial relationship, you might be focused very much purely, say, on the price or service levels or traditional procurement questions, and this sort of an approach. And that will lead you in a particular path in a way that, say, a collaboration approach doesn't necessarily take you down. So, Junaid, I know this was something that we had talked about as really an important principle to get off from the beginning, and it'd be great to get some of your perspectives on that and how you've seen those two models play out in practice.
No, Josh, I couldn't agree more, and thanks for the opportunity for joining you today on this session. So I think understanding the problem you're trying to solve is really, really important, and we can sometimes get a bit carried away with the hugely exciting and vibrant community around us. So when you're thinking about the digital health startup ecosystem, there's such incredible imagination happening in that space. And many of these companies need a place to play. That could be a place to play with pharma companies, or it could be hospital systems or otherwise. And then hospital systems have huge inbound from companies wishing to work with them. And at times, the hospital hasn't declared its strategy on digital health or what it wishes to do, nor has a pharma company. But clearly, you could see the potential complementarity between certain capabilities in the digital health ecosystem and also what you might want to do within a pharma space or a hospital space, or indeed a big tech space. But if you haven't got a problem you're going to go for together, it's going to be really, really hard to think through actually what's the end value that's going to be created as a consequence of your collaboration, partnership, or transaction. So if companies already have existing value propositions, is this going to be something that a hospital or a pharma company can buy off the shelf, and it can be just seen as a simple transaction that fits with an unmet need? Or indeed, will it be a collaboration? Will there be joint creation of something where both parties are bringing something new to the table, and there'll be the creation of new IP? In this circumstance, we're also just assuming that there are two parties, but more often than not, increasingly, there may be more than two parties within any given transformation or transaction. But I think the thing that has to be thought of as a base case, and sometimes I think that thing that is forgotten about until much later on, is what's the problem you're trying to solve? And have you developed a build by partner strategy for how you're going to address that problem? Are you going to try and build it in-house? Do you have the competency, skills, resources to do so? Are you going to buy it off the shelf? Or actually, will you collaborate and partner with agencies to think about creating new value into the ecosystem? So,
and on that, one thing we're sort of seeing in the projects that we're working on is that actually the number of partners, and you touched upon this, that you may end up working with could be numerous, but also could evolve over the life of a particular project. And I think it's really important to see how the industry is sort of developing, whether that's as simple as having the flexibility to swap out who your cloud provider is, or having APIs to plug into particular databases and things that you're working on can be sort of really important. I mean, how would you recommend that, say, either a pharma company or a hospital, whoever, somebody in this space, how do you find out what's going on in the market? How do you find out these trends and think about who are the best partners to work with?
So I think everybody is a bit of a specialist in this, and most people are somewhat generalists. So I don't think you can escape just understanding the space, especially in the post-pandemic world. However, I do think there is a skill to engaging with the market and doing some market intelligence and thinking through actually what are the types of companies that you wish to engage in. It takes a degree of digital maturity to think through, are you only ready to engage with established large tech companies, or actually are you willing to work with a startup? And that startup could be series A, B, or C, but it takes a different kind of energy and a different kind of competency to engage with startups at different stages of their own maturation, I think. And so depending on the digital maturity of your organization, be you a pharma company, big tech company, hospital system, that will probably dictate what your risk appetite is. And that risk appetite will then allow you to understand the market. So I learned a lot from working with startups when we set up Velocity Health. I learned even more when trying to engage in something at the pharma level, thinking about doing something transformative across, say, a vaccine pathway or a cancer pathway. I've learned something even more now kind of being embedded within a large tech company. But those experiences can be helpful when people are thinking about engaging a hospital, a pharma company, or a big tech. And I've got a bit of a playbook in my head around what needs to be true for certain types of companies to engage with other types of companies to create value.
Yes, it's great. And also, who you partner with can also affect other aspects of these projects that maybe not be fully appreciated until you get into them. If you are partnering, say, with and we'll come to this a bit later in the presentation about sort of tech perspectives and pharma perspectives and how they can be different, but also with startups, they may have a really excellent capability in a particular aspect of technology, but may not be necessarily fully versed in, say, software as a medical device requirements or other things that mean if you are partnering with them, there's not just the sort of cost of, say, paying for the technology, there's the resource and administrative overhead and the sort of knowledge transfer and the sharing that needs to take place if that's the type of partner that you choose. If you're perhaps going to a more established provider into the health tech space, then some of those things may be more fully developed, but that also can change depending on which markets you're going to. If you want to sort of roll out a solution in mature markets or go global, you're going to have a whole range of other challenges, and that sort of leads nicely into the next topic, which is, let's say we've understood what our project is, what the sort of gap in the market is, we've done our diligence, we know these are the people we want to work with. The next thing we just wanted to talk about for the audience is, well, what sort of diligence do you need to do, and how do you do that at the right time? And I mentioned software as a medical device. This is obviously a digital health workshop, so software inevitably is going to be part of what you're dealing with. It's really important that you get certain upfront regulatory requirements understood and defined from the beginning. And it's not as simple as, say, just software as a medical device. Digital health projects touch upon many different areas that you need to consider. These include healthcare regulation, data protection law, medical confidentiality law, IP, competition law, and so on. And to understand the implications of all of these different areas, it sort of comes back to some of the other points about how's this going to work, what's the value, who's going to get the value from particular aspects of this project, and we'll talk about some of the commercial models, but you need to understand those things to go through all the different legal areas. Now, there's a lot that we could talk about, and we could probably have a week-long workshop on each of the topics I've just mentioned. But clearly, it's not, we also have to operate in the real world where there are resource constraints. There's also a need to move quickly enough to deliver these projects. And whilst we could go through and engage in a project like this with trying to tick off every item, there is an art as much as a science as to knowing how do you do the right level of diligence at the right time. Because if you try and cover off everything and engage on every particular issue, it's the sort of paralysis by analysis. And these projects can become unworkable if you're also at sort of an end of the spectrum where you're trying to go through everything. Now, some things will be fundamental and non-negotiable, like software as a medical device rules from the beginning. If you're going to be building software that's used to make decisions about people and affect their health, you need to think very carefully about how do you do that from the beginning. Now, there are ways in which you can triage these issues. You might, for example, look to do a project where actually if the first thing you want to do is more of a pilot, so you're not necessarily going to have the full go-to-market strategy with a particular software as a medical device product, but maybe it's a more limited environment to prove that it works and the technology works, and then you go and build it. But you need to think carefully and do that deliberately so you don't waste time and resource. So one thing that the legal teams can obviously help you with, and people like us can help with, is how to ask those questions at the right time. But Junaid, just generally, it'd be great again to get your perspectives on how you've seen diligence in these projects from the legal side work well or maybe not work well, and when do you ask the questions, and how do you get that balance right between really understanding all of the sort of legal risk implications and actually just getting on with it, and making sure that we're not spending 6 months or 2 years analyzing all the possible regulatory implications, but actually trying to do something that helps have an impact on patients and innovation.
So I'm just thinking about what I would add, Josh, to what you've eloquently said. So I would probably say I'm a very simple person, right? So I think it goes back to first order principles. What's the problem you're trying to solve? And what's the scope of that project? How complicated do you want to make it? And again, what's your risk appetite? One of the superpowers I've seen of working with colleagues such as yourself and Daniel is you do try and make the complex simple. And it's a skill that I think really, really is effective and works. But then again, you could be on one side of the fence, and then there could be lawyers on the other side of the fence that may not necessarily have the same approach to things. And so then things get lost unless the client can give you a clear direction and define the objective, i.e. what's the problem you're trying to solve, the scope and the risk appetite to give you some direction. So ensuring that those principles are set out front, I think will enable the best work to come at the end of it. Ultimately, this could end up being a bit of a David Goliath thing too, right? So who typically does the diligence inside a large organization? Could be procurement. So what is the role procurement would have in undertaking some of these activities? And have those procurement activities been set up, again, for large organizations? And are they amenable to what a startup needs? And then I think it goes back to the champion for a startup or a project inside the organization who's willing to innovate in and around things, to think about that minimal viable project that will allow you to get things done, to maybe transform the organization you're working with and accelerate. And so one of the hospitals that I sit on the board of, one of the questions that I keep coming back to is, what have we learned during the pandemic that we could keep? And what are we going to keep moving forward? Because we were able to innovate at extreme pace and scale without huge amounts of bureaucracy. And much of that was around translational research. And so actually, if you're thinking about doing research endeavors, it's quite different to necessarily real world endeavors. But what can we learn from translational research projects and organizations and take those principles into projects such as what you're referencing over here? Because we are breaking new ground. We are in a brave new world. And we do need to begin to leverage the talent expertise in the ecosystem around us to try and deliver exceptional care back to the patients and public that we serve. And that would be the same in a pharma company as it would be in a hospital, and indeed anybody who's in the healthcare space. And we shouldn't let all of this resource just lay on the back. However, we've got to do the right thing and do it in the right way. So diligence is critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, defining the project. So what you're diligencing is really key. So clearly we could talk about this for a long time, but certainly hear you in terms of working with the procurement team to think about these projects. Again, is a transaction or a collaboration, and if you're viewing something that's really a collaboration through too much procurement lens and throwing large standard form corporate or other policies at a project or a startup, you're just going to get into a clash that doesn't allow you to innovate at the pace that you sort of referenced there. So that all those things remain hugely important. So we might shift gears now to talk about some of the commercial aspects in a bit more detail, and Daniel will take the lead on this part of the discussion.
So, thanks, Junaid, for framing the the legal and regulatory diligence in that all important context that you described. So, as well as there being myriad legal and regulatory diligence questions, these projects will also give rise to multiple diligence questions from a commercial perspective, all of which need to be covered at the right time. Now, certainly from our perspective, those questions don't necessarily always get asked until some way on into certain projects, and dare I say, sometimes not necessarily asked at all in the life of a given project. And as a result, we've seen projects sometimes have to be restructured or indeed abandoned because of assumptions that were made at the beginning that weren't necessarily stress tested. And so questions that come to mind of a commercial nature, and it'll be great to get your views on. So looking at them as a basket of questions. So you alluded to it earlier. What's the value proposition out of the project? What are you looking to value? Are you looking to deliver? Then to whom is it that you have to demonstrate that value? And how are you going to do that? What is your digital health solution, your service, your product ultimately going to consist of? What's going to be the cost of providing that solution, and who's going to pay for it? So there's a whole bundle of critical questions, all with a commercial thread running through them, and so let's just look at those individually. And so first of all, what's the value proposition? So this is being able to prove to someone that value exists in what it is that you're developing, and convincing someone that they're going to pay for it. So obviously, first of all, is identify what is that value proposition. And coming back to what Josh said near the beginning, identifying, well, how do I frame this? How do I get my arms around what the value proposition is? So am I looking to decrease the number of hospital admissions for a given patient population? Am I looking to do something more general in terms of decreased utilization of a healthcare system, or a general wellness proposition? How broad, how specific is it? So again, Junaid, thoughts on what you've seen in the challenges in defining that value proposition in these deals?
So I suppose one amongst the challenges is what's the degree of transparency that both parties, or more than both parties, can engage in to talk it through and be super honest and transparent with each other. If you're entering a collaboration, I think a degree of transparency is really, really quite critical. And then you lay out your cards on the table to say, does 1 + 1 really equal 5? Or does 1 + 1 just add enormous strain and pressure to it? And should we not continue? And are we really bought into something that might take a few years to materialize? When I think about value for healthcare related projects, I often think about them with almost like a triple win. It has to be valuable for, say, the two parties: organization X, digital organization, organization B, healthcare ecosystem, big pharma or big tech. And then ultimately, what's the value being created to patients, public, and society? So in my mind, if you can, and your project is in such a scope, articulating it with those three lenses is helpful, because ultimately what you want to try and benefit is patients, public, and society, I would presume. That being said, if you can do all the steps that I think, Daniel, you mentioned, you're probably not too far away to thinking about ultimately what in the UK, the MHRA and NICE would want to see if you're thinking about something at scale. So maybe at this moment in time, the parties are thinking about doing something at the research or translational research, say, and they're doing a pilot. But ultimately, if you're going to go to NICE and you're thinking about cost effectiveness, you have to demonstrate what's the real utility of what you've done and what's the added value. And if you're going to go to the regulator, you need to demonstrate safety, efficacy, etc., within your submissions. So everything that you've said is spot on. But I do think that those upfront conversations and some degree of transparency helps to build a relationship. And those relationships will be critical above and beyond the contracts that is signed in order for you to think about that long-term work that you'll be engaging in together.
And then, so you've got your value proposition, then of course you've got to demonstrate that to someone, and working out who it is that you need to demonstrate it to isn't always trivial. So is your audience a hospital system? Is it a GP? Is it a health plan or other payer? Is it the consumer? Is it a bit of all of those? And so translating that into a collaboration, you need to understand that, because you need to then build in the relevant terms that govern, okay, how are we, the collaboration partners, going to prove that value? What role will each of us take? So for example, you may need to engage in a study to demonstrate that value. So who's taking on what responsibilities in relation to that study? It might not be a clinical trial, it may be some other form of study, but having an understanding of what that is key, because that puts you on a trail of inquiry. I need to run a study to build up my evidence base. So what kind of study is it going to be? What kind of approvals might I need? How big a population might I need? How long do I need to run it for? And then crucially, therefore, how much is all this going to cost as well? And so one question just leads to another, but all of those things need to be, as you said, transparent with your partners and a clear understanding. So I'll pause there, and Junaid, if you've got thoughts on this question of who are you demonstrating to?
And so I think all of that is what I would agree with. And I think there is a bit of scientific rigor if you think about what works for a pill, potion, or lotion. And we're thinking about the research that we do across the world, but in the UK in particular, in and around this space. And that model typically works. And I think what we're thinking about is how do you extend that model to something in the digital health space? And we've seen some really good examples of this, I think, over the last couple of years. We see some unicorns emerge. They do some great work here in the UK, they do some international work, and then they think about scaling. But ultimately, putting those measures in place and having some level of consistency really is quite helpful to create belief. Because although we believe in this brave new world with the convergence of medicine, technology, biology, a lot needs to happen in the ecosystem around us, around that transformation. So hospitals need to embed these, or primary care needs to embed this innovation into a workflow. And if you don't have a true understanding of the pain it takes to undertake that transformation, you may never be successful. And building those specific measurables in at the front might also include provider experience, be it physician, nurse, pharmacist, or other. It may be patient experience at the end of it. And those qualitative measures may be as important as the quantitative ones. So again, that due consideration is going to set you up for success moving forward.
And then I'll quickly explore one associated point before we sort of move themes. And as mentioned earlier, assessing who's going to pay for this, what's it going to take to convince them to pay. Of course, who pays might not be the person that you're demonstrating the value to, principally. And what's your cost of goods? What's your cost of service? And a major challenge with many digital health projects is that they evolve over time as to what it will actually consist of. And this comes back to a point that Josh was alluding to. You may swap providers in and out of components of your service, which consists of multiple technologies pulled together to deliver a given solution. And all of that can affect the cost, and it may change over time. So you need to have some sort of collaboration structure that can cater for that sort of flux and that kind of flexibility. And then, of course, a byproduct is that you keep retesting your assumptions, review it, reassess. Is it still the same value proposition some way in to where you started? And taking a leaf out of perhaps more tech than pharma, being comfortable with failing early and often is probably the way to go. Any comments, Junaid?
Yes to all of the above. And I think if I was to try and offer a summary, it's that product market fit. So sometimes companies have this imagination, and quite rightly so, of building a better future for tomorrow without thinking about building a better future for today. So addressing the problems of today will allow us to be successful tomorrow. And when I used to be a commissioner, I used to get a bunch of companies trying to sell me stuff, but it was imagining what the world would look like 3 to 4 years from now. And the moment you said to them, actually, can you solve these problems that we have, these 15 ones that we have right now that are unsexy, but actually if you do these things, it will build that better future, they kind of run away. So we have to address the things that are absolutely needed now. And so if you think about the role that digital health companies can play in recovery globally, what we can do around equity and access to healthcare globally, these things are going to be big, big problems. And we can definitely demonstrate value here, but product market fit is going to be so critical to everything that you've said to think about scale.
Super. So we're gonna switch from our diligence, our legal and commercial diligence topics, into two themes that we introduced earlier on, and that are inherent in many digital health collaborations. So the first is the fact that you've got pharma in one corner, tech in another corner in many situations here, and they have different views. And so we'll talk about balancing those views. And then the second theme that we'll look at is a sort of analogous concept, which is whether you're pharma or tech, but then you're collaborating with a hospital system and some of the unique considerations there. So I'll hand back to Josh to chat about those themes.
Thanks, Daniel. So yeah, on the first one, yeah, pharma and tech have very different perspectives and different attitudes to risk. Many tech players grew up in an environment where their business is generally not regulated. Obviously, that's changing as tech becomes more pervasive and part of everyday life, whether that's privacy regulation or increasing regulation of content or other things where you see tech, antitrust and the like getting more and more regulated. But in its early stages, certainly there was much more freedom, and that sort of approach and attitude permeates how contracts and commercial transactions or collaborations are done when you're dealing with a tech provider to a degree. And of course, pharma has really the opposite here, in that they're very risk averse, often operating under hugely prescriptive regulatory requirements. The pharma company will have no problem with a quality agreement that is, very, very long and goes through all sorts of detail about who's doing what in a particular situation, and you wouldn't necessarily see that, particularly say with startups in the digital health space. So one of the things that you really have to try and balance is how do you deal with tech companies and the Facebook or the Meta of the world, and the move fast and break things attitude. Also recognizing that digital health projects do adapt and evolve. There is a need for flexibility. So that sort of tech desire to move quickly and not be tied down sometimes is quite advantageous when your project evolves. But at the same time, when you're up against this idea of everything having to be documented and the like, and sometimes actually you do need to do that because of regulatory purposes. If we go back to the SAMD example, having the quality system and the design history file all together, you do need to do some of those things. But Junaid, how do you think about getting the balance right between moving with innovation? You touched upon this in your remarks about your role with the hospital that you work with. How do you get that balance between the innovation that you want and the pace, but also recognizing, say, the need to be properly careful, and how do you get that right? Because that's not easy.
I think what you just said is right. So it's not easy. So we've got a few things to think about. One is there's massive heterogeneity, right, across pharma companies, within pharma companies, and across tech and within tech. And if I'm a big Spider-Man geek, right? So when you think about Uncle Ben's message to Peter Parker around, with great power comes great responsibility, maybe with great health and great digital health comes great responsibility. Like, we have to think about the true respect. We have to think about health data in particular if we're going to undertake this transformation. And certainly many big tech companies are really thinking through privacy principles, AI principles, ethical AI, not just for healthcare, but across their product suites. And I think those are deep, deep things to consider when you're thinking about handling anything that can affect people's lives. be that from the consumer side or all the way up to complex managements of vulnerable adults. So with that in mind, if I think about the risk appetite across pharma, one of my observations is that they're in the risk game, right? So when you think about what the R&D side of pharma does, they are used to failure, and their hit rate is pretty poor, but they engage, and big pharma does tremendous deals with the likes of biotechs and others, where they're really entering a space of risk. The manufacturing side of pharma typically is also now undergoing massive transformation in the digital world. And then the commercial side of the organization, where some of the deal flow comes very much towards the end, they wish to innovate, but they are sometimes held back by either their interpretations of regulations or indeed what the deal that they're allowed to make could be. And so throughout that spectrum, there may be an opportunity to think about when you engage with your product, if you're a digital health startup, and at what point of the life cycle you engage. And what's, again, is that value proposition for the R&D side versus the manufacturing side versus the real world evidence side versus the commercial side. And just understanding that within the pharma company, that not all sides are created equal, and the power typically gravitates to one or more portions of that. And understanding how you navigate pharma is probably a skill in its own right. Similarly, I think within hospitals, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And where are you engaging? Are you engaging at the level of the executive if you're given the permission? And are you aligned with a strategic objective that that hospital or the NHS or that health system is going under? It's not probably enough to just engage, in my mind, at the departmental level, because if you're thinking about accessing data, you do then need to think about the role of the CIO, the CTO, the data protection officer, the risk and privacy officer, and understand really whether you're ever going to be able to get off launchpad to reach the moon with your aspirations, because you may or may not be able to if you haven't navigated the external environment properly, nor have you set up the right executive sponsorship in your project to undertake it to the best of your abilities. But with all of that in mind, as you've mentioned, with the regulators now transforming, when 2 weeks ago you had MHRA, FDA, and NICE coming up with some really interesting models around how they will collectively work on AI together, or software as a medical device. I think we're seeing collaborations form across regulators, and I would view the role of the regulator as an enabler, but actually how do we work with regulators in order to unleash the power of innovation through providers, be they technology companies, providers, hospitals, or pharma companies, to allow their innovations to reach the masses?
There's so much in all of that to sort of touch upon. I'm conscious of the time. A couple of things that just jumped out for me. It's perhaps beyond the scope of this presentation, but I think it's worth mentioning. You talked about sort of AI and equity and these things. I think it's going to be a huge challenge over time, sort of separately for those on the call. So for those setting up businesses that are going to deploy AI and train data, there's a clear need for the world as a whole to make sure that we're not just dealing with patient data analysis of particular types of people from particular backgrounds. That's a huge challenge. I think it's a very interesting point for all of us to sort of think about. With the few minutes left that we've got, perhaps we'll come to just a few observations and comments on dealing with hospital systems, picking up on the point you made, Junaid, around executive sponsorship. Many digital health projects are a bit risky. They're unknown. There'll be new things that people have to encounter. There'll be degrees of risk around, say, access to patient data and things in ways that haven't been done before. And in our experience, that it's absolutely critical and essential that if you are dealing with the hospital system, you do have buy-in from the leadership. And also there is a need for engagement across many fronts. A hospital is not just also the CIO or say the senior executive. Clinicians will have a very strong view about particular projects depending on the nature of it. And it's important, depending on your project, that they are part of the conversation and sort of buy into what you want to do. Patients, of course, are fundamental to all of this. So in some of the projects we've been working on, patient engagement has been a huge and important part of what's going on, and that sort of is wrapped up around sort of the ethics of sort of use of data. It's also adjacent to considerations about how you inform people from a privacy perspective in terms of what's going on if you have a particular collaboration or project that's very much about data-driven analysis and use of data with AI and other technologies to come up with innovation. So I guess the point we just really want to highlight there in the few minutes that we've got is that really, really important to engage with all of the stakeholders, in addition to having the senior level buy-in to make these things really a success. If you don't have those things together, it can just make it sort of more challenging. And frankly, when dealing with hospital systems, people can get very excited at the start of the contracting process to go and do something innovative, but these are long-term deals. And once the contract is sort of signed, you need the people on the ground who are at the coalface to really, buy in and carry the project forward to make it work, because they do evolve and they're often long-term things. So we see engagement is hugely important. And Junaid, just be again interested in your perspectives as to how you've seen that sort of play out, and what are maybe some things to consider for those in the audience who are thinking about doing deals with hospital systems from an engagement perspective.
Absolutely. So I'd say when I've seen projects be stopped, it's when there's undue risk being created for that hospital ecosystem, and the engagement hasn't been done as appropriately as you've mentioned. So it could be that whatever the digital endeavor is, it could be introducing risk, and it's unknown to what's happening at the executive level or the board, because sometimes little pet projects can emerge, but those pet projects are still potentially involving patients. It could involve data, and actually you do need oversight over all of these things, especially when you're thinking about the role of digital data analytics as it relates to AI or anything that touches patient data. There has been some really incredible innovation happening across a few hospitals, and Birmingham Hospital, for example, and UCLH now are setting up a data trust committee or data access committee, which will be chaired by a patient and have representation from the staff. So true engagement at that local level and empowering patients, public and staff to think about how the data will be used and engaging them upfront. And it's one of the recommendations that I believe that came out of some of the work that came out of the Wellcome Trust. Clearly, it would be nice to have something national in and around this, but in the absence of that, local providers are absolutely innovating and working with their research departments, if they have those, to think about what that innovation looks like. But when you think about the role of the hospital, that hospital is constantly innovating and thinking about the operational things it has to deliver today, but it's also thinking about the transformation it has to deliver tomorrow. On the primary care side, you have emergence of large-scale primary care providers, Operos Health, and others who are also thinking about innovation in the primary care space and the community healthcare space. Each of these groups, of course, are then within a regulatory ecosystem of HRA, HDR UK, NHSX, NHS Digital, the BMA, and others. And they're constantly having to weigh up the risks and benefits of any innovation. I think none of them really want to maintain the status quo. They need to move, but they may not necessarily move at the pace that digital companies want to move based on the regulatory environment around them. But they will move, and you probably have to be a little bit patient as they do that. And although they need to be patient, you also have to always be conscientious of the role that patients can play in the work that is undertaken.
That's great. Thank you, Junaid, and that's a kind of a very resonant point to draw the discussion to a close with. I'll attempt to summarize some key takeaways. First of which is a new one coming from you, Junaid, which is with great digital health projects comes great responsibility to continue your Spider-Man theme, which is worth remembering, I think, for everyone. But just to ensure that you ask the right questions appropriately early on. Remember that these projects typically involve many legal and regulatory areas, and you're just going to need to triage your approach and balance getting bogging everything down with overextensive diligence against missing something fundamental. So get that balance right. Each party is going to need to be willing to share in some degree of risk if this is going to happen as a collaboration, and that's entirely appropriate. Working out what the allocation of that risk is obviously part of the art of negotiation. Emphasizing again, as Junaid said, ensure early engagement of all the right stakeholders, work out who those stakeholders are. It's critical to get in the right place at the right time, patient representative engagement, IG leads, regulators, and so on. Keep your assumptions under review and be prepared to flex and change your approach as you go, as more details come to light as you work through your project. And that places a premium on effective governance and relationships between the collaboration partners in a way that many traditional collaborations don't necessarily rely on that so much. So hopefully that summarized the discussion. Thanks very much again for joining us, and in particular, thank you to Junaid Bajwa for joining us and for his great thoughts throughout. Goodbye, everyone.